Hello and welcome to this exclusive webinar from Australian Wildlife Conservancy. My name is Joey Clarke and I'm AWC's Senior Science Communicator. I'm speaking to you today from Gadigal country in Sydney, where I live and work. Today we're bringing you a conversation about the unsung heroes of the Australian bush, species which play an outsized role in shaping their environment. So our focus today is not just on the animals, but asking, what are they up to? Think of every honey eater visiting a flowering tree, all of those digging and burrowing mammals, the intricate relationships between wildlife and the environment. We call some of these animals ecosystem engineers. And by the end of this webinar, I hope you'll have a deeper appreciation of the important jobs that animals play in their ecosystems. It's my pleasure to introduce our speakers today. Tim Allard, our esteemed CEO, who's just back from the US. Tim, welcome.
Thank you, Joey.
And Dr. Ali Ross, wildlife ecologist at Yucumurra in South Australia. Ali's in the middle of surveys. She's been chasing numbats all morning and spent last week in the Flinders Ranges at Buckaringa running our vertebrate surveys there. Ali, it's always great to speak to you. Thanks for joining again today.
G'day, Joey. Always lovely to speak to you too.
Tim, would you like to start? Say good day and welcome people to the call.
Thanks, Joey. Yeah, and welcome to everybody. We're rapidly, weirdly, fastly approaching the end of the year, and it's easy to get caught up in everything and the busyness of what's going on. But it's this time of year where we start to reflect on what have we achieved through the year, and it's been like every year at AWC, it's been a monumental year of things that we've achieved, not least our new strategic plan, which is an ambitious strategic plan, necessarily ambitious for the next 10 years. But inside all of that is understanding the work that we're doing and the rewilding of species. And that program around bringing species back from where they've been lost is something that I find particularly interesting, because it's not just there's a conservation of the species in isolation. That's a really important thing that we do. And it's a critical thing for many of the species in which we work. But for the work we do, some species would have most likely gone extinct. Beyond that, though, why I think this webinar in particular is one of the most interesting and important webinars we do. It's about the recreation and the restoration of processes. And you might have heard us at AWC talking about this over the years of when you put a bilby or a digging animal back into the landscape, and the turning over of the soil and the leaf litter and the nutrients and the moisture being retained, the carbon improvements, the vegetation quality improvements. It's a restoration of a landscape process. And we're not just doing this in isolated pockets. We're doing this at a national level. So thank you for joining us. I'm particularly excited about this webinar. It's something I find personally very interesting and goes to the core of what AWC is all about. Thanks, Joey.
Well, let's get straight into it. They burrow, they feed, they nourish forests. Let's introduce some of the interesting ecological effects that animals have on their environments. And I'd like to start with the sort of hero of our Unsung Heroes campaign. This is a small communal living kangaroo about the size and dimensions of a soccer ball, which lives in tunnels underground. I'm not making this up. And not just tunnels, but huge warren systems in the desert. They were probably one of the most abundant mammals in Australia before European colonization. Hundreds of millions of these animals across about half of the continent. I'm talking, of course, about the burrowing bettong. Ali, you've been to some places with burrowing bettongs. Can you tell us what they're like to work with?
They're one of my favorite species that I've ever worked with. They will give you a nibble if you're handling them, but they're not, they're mostly a really easy species to work with. They have a really interesting way of communicating with each other. So every now and then we'll be releasing one after we've processed it, and it will as it hops away. So always an enjoyable species for us and for volunteers. And as you said, what a crazy way to live. You can have, I've read somewhere like 30 individuals in a single warren system, and when you see the structures, they're insane. They're They look like a car park almost, holes going everywhere, multiple levels. So one hole going this way, another hole underneath it going that way, with a whole extended family of booties living in there.
And it can be hundreds of meters of tunnels in one of these warren systems. So it really is like a whole underground empire of mammals. And these are just one of the digging animals in Australia, but they're one that we think was very abundant before colonization. There's good evidence for that.
Mm.
I remember the first time I went to New Haven in Central Australia, out on Walpurgis and Luritja country, visiting some of the historic bettong warrens. So this is a species that was found in Central Australia and was pretty much wiped out by about the 1940s in that part of the world. And at New Haven, because of the calcrete soil in some areas, their warren systems, even from decades ago, are really well preserved. So going out there about 10 years ago and looking at these almost like ghost houses. They were kind of the structures that had been left by these animals, but the animals were long gone because of cats and foxes. It was quite a touching moment just to realize how much of that work was missing from the landscape. And of
Mm.
course, going back there now, 10 years later, the bettongs have moved back home. They're moving back into those warren systems
It's
and
so
sort of
exciting.
renovating them. Yeah. Um, where have you worked with burrowing bettongs before, and what does it look like on the surface?
So I'm coming to you from Yokomara Sanctuary on Ngaraku land, and we have a healthy population of burrowing bettongs here. And like you said, New Haven's got booties as well now. Super exciting. And like as you said, these insane relic structures. We talk about, the aeration of the soil with these digging mammals, and then something that big, like that's a lot of aeration. And
Mm,
so when we lose this animal from the ecosystem, we're losing the animal and the function. So people
mm,
come out and they see this really cool species here at Yokomara or New Haven or wherever. And, it's like this exciting, like, wow, what an opportunity. You're so lucky to live here. But like, man, these animals used to be everywhere. You're supposed to
mm.
have them in your backyard.
Yeah.
This function is you're supposed to look out your bedroom window and see this happening outside as well.
Mm. That idea which we've discussed previously about shifting baselines, that with
Mm,
each generation you lose the memory of just how abundant wildlife is supposed to be. Um,
mm.
and that's, yeah, I've been thinking about that a lot. Just that, like you say, that process is normal. We're meant to have these landscapes full of animals, and that's missing. Have you been involved in any of the reintroductions of this species?
Was one of the first reintroductions I was involved with. It was so special. We had a couple of interns, so right at the start of their conservation career, and we were trapping all night and drove these animals to the airport literally the next morning and put them on their plane and sent them off from Yucamara to New Haven. So middle of the desert. Crazy idea that they could go from this, semi-arid trees everywhere set clay, not clay, sort of different soil
Yeah.
structure all the way to a desert and thrive as as you know.
And they have thrived. Their numbers are doing very, very well in the absence of feral predators in all of the fenced havens where we've got them. Um, and it gives us the opportunity to look a bit more into the impact of all of that earth moving that they do, putting these diggers back into the landscape. We can find out more about what that means for vegetation, what it means for water infiltrating into the soil, and the flow of nutrients in different areas. One of our ecologists, Dr. Bryony Palmer, as part of her PhD, looked at which animals were using the warrens of these bettongs. So kind of using the structures that the bettongs created as shelter. So they're kind of sort of supplementing habitat. She found that 14 other native animal species were using warrens across 3 sites where they'd been reintroduced. So it does have flow-on effects, not just for the health of the soil, but for other animals living there as well. Um, what about rabbits? I know, in a lot of places we're missing the native species, but we've, in a lot of cases, replaced them with huge, plague population of rabbits. Do
Mm.
they not sort of replace that function with their burrows?
Yeah, it's like you on the outside, it's so easy to look at a rabbit warren and see all these holes going into the soil and this turnover and think you're getting the same animal but with a different name. But once you look at the science, it's very clear that they're not fulfilling that ecosystem function the same as a bettong would.
Mm.
They have when they crop, their teeth tend to rip things out of the ground, whereas our native species do tend to crop things so you leave the root system intact. So not only are you getting the impact of grazing, but then the impact of essentially losing a species from local areas, which extrapolates out to a much bigger function. So we talk about ecosystem heroes. This is like the ecosystem villains, you know?
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. It's not like for like replacing all of these
Exactly.
very diverse digging marsupials and other mammals with rabbits, which, sort of became the one that thrived in place of that great community of native mammals. Um, so the burrowing bettong, just a great character, a great animal, very charismatic, and truly one of the unsung heroes of the Australian bush. You live with some other burrowing animals where you are in South Australia, Ali. Tell us about the southern hairy-nosed wombat.
Well, so first of all of our animals here dig perfect ankle-sized rolling holes as well. So if you ever come visit, that's something to look out for. But I do love the southern hairy-nosed wombat warrens out here. We survey them by visiting every single warren on the property. So it's about 1,500 warrens, and we find them by using satellite imagery. So the impact they have on the environment is so strong that I don't even have to zoom all the way in to mark each warren on a map just from satellite.
So from space, you can see the effect of burrowing wombats on the landscape at Yucumara.
Yeah, people always talk about the Great Barrier Reef being visible from space. Whatever, one wombat also visible, no worries.
How does that change over time? I imagine their numbers might go up and down in response to drought, but the burrows would persist a bit longer. Like, can you sort of tell how the
Mm.
population's doing, or is that a longer term effect?
Yeah, well, so we've done this survey back in 2020, so we can revisit all those warrens as well and see how they're going. So they're all, either in use or clearly available for use. The really old ones sort of collapse a bit, but wombats are like all they do is dig. I think they used to be a preferred pet species until people brought them home and they just dug up their yards. You can't stop them. That's what they're built for. So this side of a warren will collapse. They're already digging, annex number 15 over there.
Mm.
They're the world's greatest renovators.
And that's not to be confused with the critically endangered northern hairy-nosed wombat that we also work with in Queensland. So we've talked plenty about that before, and I'll refer people to other webinars about that. While we're on digging animals, I came across this incredible paper looking at goannas and the effect that they have. I think this is another contender for unsung hero. There are lots of different species of goannas in Australia. Some of the large ones are Gould's monitor and the yellow spotted monitor. They're closely related. And they dig burrows into sandy soil for their nest. And this particular study was looking at excavating burrows to find out the structure of what was going on beneath the surface. And I have to share the diagram that they come up with because it's unbelievable. It's a kind of corkscrew structure that apparently extends down up to 4 meters below the surface of the ground. And that wasn't expected by the researchers at all. It was a big surprise. Um, it's apparently the deepest burrow of any vertebrate that we know of. So this amazing kind of auger into the ground. And again, these are very widespread species. They're found right across northern and inland Australia. Um, the paper also tried to model what it looks like with the density of burrow holes on the surface. And this is in just a 10 meter by 10 meter square, this incredibly sort of perforated landscape where, the soil is completely aerated with goanna burrows, um, providing
That's
habitat
insane.
for 750 individual animals of 28 different species. And that's across just 16 burrows. One of the burrows had 418 frogs in one burrow. So in the arid
Amazing.
zone, that sort of habitat created by a lizard is so valuable for things like burrowing frogs. How cool is that?
That is so insane. That image is crazy to see. Like you walk along and you see the little, the pile of sand, we call it the spoil, maybe see a goanna's head poking up, but that's like 4 meters down of function that's happening out of your eyesight. Like the animal exists, but all that is happening under the surface of the soil as well.
Yeah, that's
That
right.
was a crazy image.
Yeah, thinking below the surface. So we've talked a lot about digging. So there's the bettongs, the wombats, goannas with their nesting burrows, digging for all sorts of different purposes, for food, for shelter, for breeding. Um, there's the sorts of digging that happens for feeding in particular that is closer to the surface, and this is things like bandicoots and bilbies. And there's been some interesting studies looking at what that means for germination and sort of the health of soil with relation to plants. Can you tell us a bit about that work, Ali?
Well, yeah, once you get this hole in the ground, lots of people will be familiar with this story, but you sort of, the wind blows, it fills up with leaf litter, fills up with water, it fills up with seeds. And like when I'm at home and I'm trying to grow something in a pot, I put fertilizer in with a seed and then water it, and that's where things grow. So that's the exact same thing that happens out here. So we've got a walk that we'll do here at Yokomara if anyone's lucky enough to come visit. And we'll stop and take a look around, and every shrub that we can see is coming out of one of these holes. So the impact on the vegetation is immeasurable. You'd think that would be the main way that species start in an environment like this.
Yeah, really interesting. So without that sort of the process of that digging, a lot of the shrubs wouldn't have grown.
Yeah, exactly.
Wow.
And that's just like the seeds arriving, through wind or process of whatever. But there's other ways that animals can spread seeds around as well to even increase that amazing ecosystem function.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's a good segue to this is a photo that I took a few years ago in North Queensland, and this is the kind of thing ecologists and nature nerds love. I came across a scat of an animal. This is a cassowary poo that I came across in the wet tropics of North Queensland. And cassowaries, they're almost as big as emus. They feed almost exclusively on big fleshy fruit of rainforest trees. And a lot of those fruit have very big seeds, which wouldn't be able to disperse without some sort of help, some sort of assistance. And in fact, there's one species of tree that is only able to germinate after it's passed through a cassowary's digestive system. And there's a lot of others that benefit from that process. I found research that's been done looking at cassowary poo and in particular how long it takes for a seed to go from being gobbled up by the cassowary to passed out. It's really interesting because that determines the dispersal for some of these plants. So you can see, a few months later, that's a scat that has led to all of these seedlings springing up. It takes about 3 or 4 hours for passage of one seed through a cassowary's digestive system. And in that time, they typically travel 200 or 300 meters. So for seeds of rainforest plants, that's one of the main ways that they're able to spread through the forest. It's a fascinating example of an animal spreading and growing the rainforest in North Queensland. So you lose the cassowary, you lose the ability of those seeds to travel around. And that's one of the species that we protect at Brooklyn Wildlife Sanctuary in North Queensland.
I love how much poo we're talking about in this chat. But we always talk about things like digging because it's such an obvious thing that happens right there in front of your eyes. Poos as well, pretty obvious, but we were chatting as well about like the pollination that happens, which is such an invisible function in the ecosystem. So you were telling me about some of the species that people just don't think about as being pollinators.
Yeah, that's right. I think, typically if you said to someone, what are the main pollinators that we rely on? There's been this big campaign of Save the Bees. Bees and insects are the ones that we normally associate with pollination. Of course, birds play a really important role, especially in Australia with, all of our honeyeaters, our nectar feeding parrots like lorikeets and things like that. All of those act as pollinators as well. And then even more surprisingly, there's several species of mammals that fill this function in some systems. So you'll remember we had a project at North Head in Sydney for many years, and at that site we restored brown antechinus and bush rats, two native mammal species that were missing from the headland. And we observed those species feeding on banksias, these big, sturdy native flowers that do provide a lot of nectar. So there's nectar and insects that those animals can feed on. And in doing so, antechinus and rats actually pollinate a lot of the banksias in that ecosystem. There's even an idea I've heard that banksias evolved their sort of sturdy stems and flowers to support the body weight of those bigger mammal pollinators. So they've, it's a great example of coevolution. So it's not just insects that fulfill that role, but beautiful mammals and things like the honey possum in Western Australia, even more specialized to feed on the nectar of flowering plants.
Incredible. I saw a booty in an aeromophila literally last night. It's so
Oh,
weird seeing them in places that aren't the ground. Come on,
huh.
man.
Yeah, they're like goats climbing up into trees sometimes, aren't they?
That's exactly what they're like.
Now, Ali, you told me about another unsung hero, and in a different way. This is another native rodent, actually, so the greater stick-nest rat. And just tell us a bit about that species. So it's a native rodent, but tell us what they look like and what they do and how they change their environment.
Yeah, such a good unsung hero. I feel like, especially coming out of Halloween, people are always thinking about the ugly animals, the ones that people are scared of. Rats, spiders, snakes, these guys are super cool as well. So the greater stick-nest rat, I love an animal that's named after its defining feature. So greater stick-nest, it makes these huge stick constructions, and then it sticks them together with wee. So it has this urine that's almost like sap. It's so sticky and thick, and it glues these structures together. And then because of how good they are as builders, these structures can last like an insane amount of time in the environment. So I just found some research that's currently happening where they're taking samples from this greater stick-nest rat wee and finding it's like finding out the climate of the time it was made in, the nearby species. It's like an ice core, but a wee ice core. Incredibly useful for science and just something you wouldn't even think about.
Yeah, amazing. So kind of like chemical signatures through time stored in those nest structures through
Yeah,
their
and in
neurons.
places like the middle of the desert where those sort of, DNA structures just degrade and everything else.
Mm,
But the answer is we.
wow. Who'd have thunk it?
We
Um,
and poo in one chat, man.
moving right along. And just quickly, greater stick-nest rats, that's another one that we've reintroduced and done translocation projects with at a number of sites. Quite tricky to re-establish. They seem to be quite sensitive to environmental change. But we have been able to re-establish them at a number of sites. So an unsung hero that we're protecting and that builds these amazing structures that are also habitat for other species. Ali, perhaps a more savoury one. The Malleefowl is sort of I've described it as the inland cousin of the brush turkeys that us on the East Coast are very familiar with.
Mhm.
And they build, of course, the big nesting mounds that people might have seen with sand and leaf litter. And that also creates a sort of patchiness in the landscape. So imagine in building their mound, they rake up leaf litter from quite a big radius around that mound. They can be several meters across. So it's
Mm.
a really big structure. And that means that close to Malleefowl nest mounds, the leaf litter is much more sparse on the ground. And there's been some interesting work done to model what that means for how fire travels through the landscape. And the suggestion is, you can see in this photo, the Malleefowl mound is in the middle of the image, and the circles indicating, an area where they might have gathered leaf litter to build that mound. And so a fire moving through the mallee comes to this patch of much lower fuel load, and the modeling suggests that the fire would drop in intensity or perhaps even not burn in the area around those mounds. So it even extends to the point where a bird's nest is changing fire patterns in a whole ecosystem. That really brings home the importance of threatened species like this, which, having them in the landscape has real implications for how the whole system works.
Mm. We always talk about, yeah, the importance of having the animal, obviously, but the importance of having their function is so underrated. The idea of, every single scratch they make, hole they dig, every leaf they eat, every poo they poo is like a resource, a function that's happening that we can't replace. We can't replace by ourselves. We can't replace with introduced species. I always think about how these functions are extinct in some areas. The animal might still be alive, bilbies covered 80% of Australia, but they're gone from 70% of that range. So if they're an ecosystem engineer, then that means the ecosystem function is extinct in 70% of its range. So what does that mean for, the environment there? How long can it be gone before the ecosystem has changed irrevocably,
Yeah, we were chatting before, thinking about it as a workforce issue. We've got these industries, if you like, the digging, the fertilizing, the pollinating that needs to happen in remote parts of Australia, and we just haven't got the workforce to do it. So, restoring,
Unionize.
yeah, exactly, restoring big, healthy populations of animals is the one way that we can restore that important work. Ali, you twisted my arm before this, and you wanted me to ask you about biocrust. Now, just to explain, if you've met Ali in person before, you'll know that she is a vocal advocate for bryophytes. She's a big fan of mosses and lichens. So, Ali, you've got the floor. Tell us about why mosses and lichens are the real unsung heroes that we need to be thinking about.
Pull my arm, why don't you? I suppose I can spare some time to talk about them. I find that this is such an interesting topic to talk about with people because everyone sees lichens and mosses all the time. Literally, when you walk to your letterbox, you'll see stuff on the ground, but it's so invisible that people don't even think about it. So, your lichens, your mosses, it includes your cyanobacteria, your algae. And in places in the semi-arid region, this is the main thing that's keeping the ground where it is. So, when you drive on like a dirt road and you've got that big plume of dust behind you and it gets all in your windscreen and whatever, that's because there's nothing on the ground, like the skin of the earth, keeping the ground where it is. So biocrusts have this insane function. Because they're so small, that means that they're the habitat and food for small, tiny things, which are in turn the food for small tiny things, which are in turn for bigger things. So out here, this is the core of food webs. So some people aren't really aware of just what these things do, but they're part of the carbon cycle. They could cycle nitrogen, phosphorus. There's a species of moss that we have out here. Your Chuck's wipes, literally those blue and white things, yeah, that you've got in the kitchen. So we have a moss here that is the same absorbent potential as a Chuck's. So 10 times its weight in water is what it can absorb. And that's water that's not just running off, it's getting used in the ecosystem. So, and that's just one species. And this is happening across the entire ground level that you're not even thinking about.
Biocrusts, the most unsung of all the unsung heroes. Thank you for that, Ali. And Ali can talk more about biocrusts. If anyone's interested, please get in touch. It's a fascinating sort of underappreciated system that supports so many Australian soils. We were talking about woylies and some of the other bettong species, so northern bettongs and woylies that you've worked with at a couple of sites. And they've got this sophisticated palate where they eat truffles, fruiting bodies of underground fungus. And that's a very large part of their diet in some landscapes. And we know that the fungus create this network that is very important for providing nutrients to different plants. In some cases, plants can only access those nutrients if the mycorrhizal fungal networks have sort of unlocked those nutrients from the soil. And you were telling me an incredible piece of research that was done was that at Yucamara as well?
Yeah, so sophisticated palate, truffles, really nice way to live. But during the drought, our populations go down, and these guys went down quite a lot during the big 2018 drought. It was record-breaking low rainfall. So we started looking for truffles on the property because we thought maybe the drought had impacted them as well. And that's why the woylies weren't recovering. They didn't have anything to eat. So we didn't find a single truffle on the whole property. We brought in the truffle expert of South Australia. She couldn't find a single truffle. So we're like panicking, thinking that these animals are going to starve. We ended up getting poos of these brush-tailed bettongs, more poo facts, yes. And we looked at them in the microscope and you could see that the poos were full of truffle spores. So in that slide that Joey's just shared, all those little football-shaped things, those are individual truffle spores. And then you can see that there's ones that are like sort of clear, they've got the thick rim, and then there's sort of flatter, yellower ones. That's a different species. There's round ones in there. That's a different species. The bottom right, you can see a sort of bouldery looking one. That's a different species. And you can tell that there's not much like plant matter in there. So not only are they finding truffles, but they're finding so many truffles that they don't even have to supplement their diet with anything. Purely truffle diet. So I think it goes to show that we maybe think that we can do some functions, but when it comes down to it, these animals are so evolved for their specific niches that there's no competition.
Yeah, incredible stuff. And yeah, very very sophisticated bettongs with that taste in truffles. Ali, I think we could talk for many more hours, but we've run up against the clock. So thank you for talking to me about some of these interesting ecological relationships between animals and their environments, and unpicking some of the unsung heroes that we haven't celebrated enough.
Thanks, Joey. I love talking about any of these things with you. Anytime.
Thanks so much. Tim, what did you make of that?
Well, I would just want to contribute to the poo conversation.
Okay.
I've got a bag of northern hairy-nosed wombat poo in the desk drawer in my office in Perth. And I think that's really cool because, it's one of the world's most critically endangered species. It's been on the brink. And to have a bag of northern hairy-nosed wombat poo, I think is cool. My friends and family think I'm turning into a weirdo, but I think it's really cool because it's symbolic as, my interest in that wombat poo is symbolic of the criticality of the work we do to secure these species. So I don't care what they all say. I like my wombat poo. So
Oh yeah, that's so ecologist. Just poo in the fridge, dead cat
thanks,
in the
Ali.
freezer.
Right
Sure.
back at you. But I think as Joey said right at the start, I've just come back from almost 3 weeks in the US traveling around, and you'd be living under a rock not to understand and acknowledge that there's a lot of weird things happening in the US at the moment. And it's not a comment on anybody's individual politics, but it is a very divided place. There's a lot of noise, there's a lot of negativity, and this is really something around the world that there's a lot of uncertainty in the world. In Australia, we've got the conversation happening around the EPPC Act reform, our national legislation around the environment. And there's a lot of noise and a lot of negativity. And I think this webinar, of all of the webinars we do, is a reflection on, in the midst of all that noise and uncertainty and divisiveness, is AWC is a beacon of hope and positivity and pragmatic. Get out there and, excuse the French, but get shit done at scale with measurable impact. And to me, this is precisely why I work at AWC, to listen to two superstars of Ali and Joey and the work that we do, not just at Ukumara, but we're doing that at a national level. And it's happening because the people on this call are donors. It happens, the work that Ali's been talking about at Ukumara, the work we're doing right around Australia happens because you allow it to happen. You enable that work to happen. And I really just wanted to say thank you, and particularly as we rush into the end of the year and we're all thinking about what we're going to be doing over the Christmas, New Year period, is really just to say thank you and to acknowledge you're a part of the community. You're part of a movement that is securing our natural heritage. So thank you.
Thank you, Tim. Yeah, I'd just like to add my thanks for everyone who joined us today, and thinking again about the action that these animals take. And I think similarly at AWC, we're very action focused. There's no hope without action, and what we're doing, I hope, inspires hope in you too. If you haven't made a donation, there is the opportunity to do so at australianwildlife.org. When you give to AWC, you're not just helping threatened species from sliding further towards extinction. You're helping our ecologists like Ali to drive increases in these populations and to rebuild healthy, functioning ecosystems, stitching back together those complex relationships between animals and plants and their landscapes, which have evolved together over millions of years. That's what your donation does for us and for Australia's wildlife. So thank you for your support, and I hope you enjoy the remainder of the year. Thanks, everyone. We'll see you next time.